Today we will talk about the two most important machines of the Second World War. This is the most produced tank of the Wehrmacht, Panzerkampfwagen 4, and the most produced tank of the Red Army, T-34. In the 30s, rearmament in Nazi Germany was in full swing, and a big bet was made on tank production. The Panzer IV was a German medium tank designed to support infantry, while the main functions of a medium tank were carried out by the Panzer III. However, the war with the Soviet Union showed the inability of this tank to withstand the Soviets, and the Germans preferred the Panzer IV as more promising due to the wider hull and larger turret ring diameter. As a result, it became the most numerous German tank of the Second World War. Over 8,500 Panzer IVs and upgrades were produced. In turn, the T-34 was created as a high-speed medium tank with a powerful weapon to destroy enemy tanks. The Soviet leadership wanted to replace the already outdated BT and T-26 lightly armored tanks with more armored and modern ones. Just by the end of the 30s, a new diesel tank engine was created in the Soviet Union, which contributed to the successful implementation of the project. The tank was put into service and the first prototype of the T-34 was made in 1940. Of course, the new tank was criticized primarily because of the obvious shortcomings, lack of visibility and tightness. But still, it was decided to continue production and give the opportunity to refine the weaknesses. As a result, the T-34 turned out to be an indispensable vehicle during the war years. About 35,000 tanks were produced during the pre-war and war period. The T-34 became the most produced tank of the entire Second World War. Panzer IV and T-34 met on the battlefield in 1941. I note that in the initial stages of the war, the Soviet tank was significantly superior to the German one in most parameters. The reason for this was the original idea of the Panzer IV as an infantry support tank. In addition, the Germans really underestimated the Soviet designers, and the T-34 came as a surprise to them. But we will compare not only the first used tanks, but also their subsequent wartime upgrades. The German tank was equipped with a 75mm short-barreled gun. With a barrel length of 24 calibers and an initial velocity of an armor-piercing projectile of 385 meters per second. Such a gun was powerless against both English and Soviet tanks, and soon it was replaced by a 75mm gun with a barrel length of 43 calibers and an initial velocity of an armor-piercing projectile of 770 meters per second. In 1943, the barrel length was increased to 48 calibers. Such a gun could already be dangerous for the T-34 and pierce the armor of the tank from long distances. The T-34 entered the war with a 76mm gun with a barrel length of 41 calibers and an initial velocity of an armor-piercing projectile of 662 meters per second. Until 1943, the gun easily coped with the armor of the Panzer IV and other German tanks, but, after the reinforcement of the armor and the appearance of the Tiger and Panther, it no longer provided the necessary firepower. The Soviet Union at the beginning of 1944 responded with a new one, the T-34-85, equipped with an 85mm gun with a barrel length of 54 calibers. The T-34 was also better armored. The armor of its frontal part consisted of two 45mm armor plates, the upper one, located at an angle of 60 degrees to the vertical, and the lower one, located at an angle of 53 degrees. Such an inclination gave the tank additional projectile resistance, despite the small thickness of the armor. The side armor also had a thickness of 45mm, and had no slope. The stern armor sheets had a thickness of 40mm. The upper one was located at an angle of 47 degrees, the lower one at an angle of 45. In 1943, the thickness of the upper stern sheet was increased by 5mm. Initially, the Panzer IV was an easy target for medium-caliber guns and tanks. Its armor in the frontal part was 30mm, in the side 20mm, in the stern 15mm. But thanks to the modernization potential of the tank, the Germans were able to quickly begin to eliminate the shortcomings, and before the invasion of the USSR, the thickness of the frontal armor of the hull and turret increased to 50mm, and the side armor to 30mm. In 1943, a modification with 80mm frontal armor appeared, which became a serious problem for Soviet guns. Small caliber guns no longer dreamed of penetrating such armor, and the 76mm T-34 gun was now effective only at close distances. The T-34 had a 500 horsepower engine, while the Panzer IV had 300 horsepower. Even despite the greater weight, the Soviet tank had better mobility and power density, had a maximum speed of 55 km per hour, while the German tank had only 40 km per hour. The additional armor of German tanks also did not contribute to mobility. In addition, the tracks of the Soviet tank were wider, and this gave an advantage in cross-country ability and maneuverability. The T-34's fuel range was also greater, but even if the German engines did not shine with power, they were more reliable and their engine life was more than 2 times higher than the modest engine life of the T-34. I would also like to note the serious advantage of the Panzer: ease of control and more comfortable, spacious space inside the tank. It must be understood that comfort for the crew is one of the most important characteristics of the tank, as it affects decision-making and their implementation. In the T-34, the main problem was the problem of poor visibility. The meager presence of surveillance equipment greatly reduced its lifespan in battle. There was no commander's cupola in the tank, and the commander observed the terrain through a periscope sight. The driver mechanic had only a periscopic viewing device for review, and the radio operator gunner had only the sight of a course machine gun. Visibility problems were solved only with the advent of the T-34-85. The Panzer IV had a commander's cupola with many viewing slots, and the driver had a wide viewing slot. The gunner radio operator until later modifications had a hatch with a viewing slot in it. In addition to all this, the German tank could fit 5 crew members, and the Soviet one, 4. In the T-34, the commander was also a gunner. Of course, this meant that fewer trained military personnel were required to operate the tank. However, if we consider the tank as a combat unit, this was an incredible problem for the Soviet tank. The already poor visibility was supplemented by the need for the commander to act as a gunner, while the Panzer IV commander could fully concentrate on exploring the battlefield and making decisions. To summarize all of the above, we can say that in the first half of the war the T-34 was superior to the Panzer IV, but the rapid modernization of the German tank evened out the situation. Probably, we can say that by the Battle of Kursk, both tanks had approximately the same combat effectiveness. And do not forget, after all, that the decisive role in a tank battle is played by the professionalism and decisions of the crew members, as well as tactical decisions made by the top leadership of tank divisions and the army. People fight, not technology.